Hi, Alyssa. Welcome to the Sisterhood.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
So, we are in a series called Faith and Art, and we're looking at various artistic expressions in the world. But often, when people hear the word art, they think of the actual artist, the actual person with the paintbrushes in their hands. And you are in that every day. So, tell everyone a little bit about your background and what you do.
Okay, great. I am a professor. I teach at Covenant College, and I'm a professor of art and art history. And I get to teach all of the art students and the non-majors about how to look well, how to write, and how to research, and how to understand the visual world.
And have you been in that for a long time?
Yes, so I just finished my 8th year of teaching, but working with art and with artists has been a passion of mine for a really long time, ever since I was a little girl. And my mother popped me on the toilet for potty training and gave me a pad of paper and said, "Stay here." So I've been making and drawing for a long time, and then when I was in undergraduate is when I learned that this whole world of art history existed, and sort of learned more about how I could use words as well to help guide people through engaging with the visual arts.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection because when I think of visual arts, I think of the experience between the artist and the viewer, if you will.
Mhm.
And often that experience is not something you can capture in words. It's
Mm,
a feeling that you have when you look at a piece of art. It is something that kind of bubbles up in you. But as a person myself who loves words, to then be able to articulate those thoughts, those feelings, those ideas,
mhm.
um, is a kind of a crystallizing of that very nonverbal experience. So is that what you help people do, is put words to the experience that they have when they're interacting with a piece of art?
Yeah, exactly. So I think a lot about what it means to put words around the act of looking, and to help people think about what happens next, right? So I think a lot of times when we think about the visual arts, we think in terms of um, issuing judgment. So a thumb, like I like this or I don't like this, a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And I think what's really exciting for me as an art historian, but especially as a Christian, is thinking about how we as viewers can also be generative, how we as viewers can also be sort of productive with that experience that we have. And so learning more about how art is made, learning more about the historical context of objects, learning more about just how to even, look closely and ask good questions of artworks are all things that kind of open up something that might otherwise feel a little bit out of our grasp, and turns it into um, something exciting that we can do with, and learn
Mhm.
from as well.
So we were looking, or we have been looking the last couple of weeks at this idea of story and how the different artistic forms use story differently. So for example, we had, someone on last week about theater, and
Mhm.
he was talking about how really the the actors and the story and the audience kind of engage on this journey from beginning to end of the whatever, the production. And it was a really fun way to look at how theater uses story. How do you think art uses or brings story uniquely into the artistic space?
That's a good question. Certainly, there are some artworks that are more focused on story than others, that are telling a story, that want to bring you along in a story. We see that especially, in representational artwork, so artworks that look like the things around us, that are perhaps narrating a history or some other kind of experience to us. But perhaps what's a more helpful way for us to think about story and the visual arts is the story of your encounter with an art object, right? So thinking about when you are interacting with this artwork, that you have this opportunity to, you're never going to be able to get back into the mind of the artist completely. And I think that's what makes visual artists in particular so generous, is because once they put their work out there, there is a kind of invitation or an opening for you as the viewer. And so you get to sort of enter into this story with the artwork, this exchange with the artwork, right? What does the artwork want from you, and what are you bringing to the artwork yourself? I also think that another way that story plays into the visual arts is how we carry around these, what I like to think of as an archive of images in our head. So everything that we've seen before, we're sort of filing that away as a means of interpreting new things that we see, right? So when we see a photograph of someone who's very frontal and maybe wearing a suit and looking directly at the camera, we have a folder in our head where we sort of slot that person in and like, oh, that's what powerful looks like, right? So these images themselves have these stories that they kind of carry inside of them, that we tap into. And so I think one of the challenges perhaps of looking well at images is realizing that so many of these images, so many of these objects kind of come with a story already, that we can't ignore. You know, like we have to be able to interact or to engage with that.
And that's interesting, because living now in such a visual culture where we're getting inundated with images, it's almost like our folders are much bigger to be pulling from. And at the same time, they may be more marketing images than maybe 100 years ago. Well, probably than 100 years ago, where my great grandmother's images were based on being outside and working on the farm, or just more of kind of the natural world around her. Those were the folders she was pulling from. So even our cultural moment impacts how we see and interpret what we are consuming visually. Would you agree?
Yeah, yes, definitely. I mean, I think it's undeniable that we live in a visual culture right now, right? And it would be impossible for someone to say, "Oh, I'm not going to look at any any images at all." They are part of every aspect of our life now. And you're right that so many of these images are marketing images, that they are meant to sort of feed into these things that we love, that we want to buy, that we desire. So I do think for Christians that raises a new level of perhaps importance of thinking well about all of the images that we see, and thinking not just about how images and artworks reflect a culture's values, reflect a culture's worldview or priorities, but how they're also shaping the people who are in it. You know, so even in the Italian Renaissance, paintings, sculptures are not just a reflection of the Italian interest in classicism, but they're also shaping people's ideas of how the world should be, right? You know, young women are receiving paintings as marriage gifts, and these paintings are teaching them something about what a good bride is, what a virtuous woman looks like, and things like that. So there's always been a way that images have been sort of molding and shaping us. We just have it on steroids now because we have so many of them.
And I would say visual artists traditionally have been people who have pushed boundaries a little bit. And now we live in a culture where the boundaries feel like they're being pushed by everybody all the time. So does that impact today's artists, do you think, as they are trying to make statements about how the world should be, that they are living in this point of extremes already.
I'm sure that it does for some artists. Certainly, I think one of the real delights of our present moment is how many different kinds of art are being made right now. So there's not, a dominant style. But certainly if you are an artist who wants to say shock your audience, that line for what constitutes shock keeps getting pushed further and further and further, right? Because of what's happening in television, because of what we see in movies or on TikTok, the line for what is shocking or might shake someone up is certainly always moving, I think, at this point.
I thought it would be interesting. I found this Madeleine L'Engle quote that I just thought was fascinating. And for those people who don't know, she's the author of the fiction work A Wrinkle in Time. And she really was someone who wrestled with her faith and calling as a writer. And she often spoke of God acting in peculiar and unsuspecting ways. And obviously she points to that one of God's most surprising moves is in the story of redemption, entering as a fallen creation through the flesh of Jesus. And she said that the incarnation suggests that nothing, including human flesh, is too fallen for adoption into God's purposes. And she argued that there can be no categories such as religious art and secular art because all true art is incarnational and therefore religious. And I thought that was so interesting. And I just really wanted to ask you, do you agree with that? I mean, what makes a piece of art spiritual or redemptive in nature or not? Because she's kind of saying, well, the incarnation, exists and it can come through in surprising ways. And I just thought it was an interesting bent. And I would love to know, as we're engaging this idea of faith and art, how you feel about that.
Yeah. That quote reminds me of another quote by the philosopher Arthur Danto, who says that art is getting across indefinable but inescapable meaning. Art is getting across indefinable but inescapable meaning. And so I think both L'Engle and Danto are really recognizing the ways that art exceeds language, that art perhaps exceeds some of our intellectual boundaries or some of the binaries that we might try to impose on it. And I think, I agree with L'Engle that the incarnation and our image bearing testify to the miracle, the wonder of a God who can give meaning to fleshiness, right? That a God who can take something as simple as the elements of bread and wine and say, like, now these have this significance that is mysterious, that can't quite be, you can't rationally wrap your mind around that. And I think that that's what good art taps into, is the sense that there's something more than what we are. I'm not sure that it is, maybe it doesn't feel as pressing these days to say, is this secular art or is this religious art? I think what I'm really interested in is, again, how we as viewers can come to artworks knowing the fullness of our story, knowing that creation, fall, redemption, consummation arc, and then recognizing these resonances in whatever art that we're looking at. Oh, this is teaching me something about a part of myself that is broken or that is fallen, or this is reminding me that there is something that is beyond what I can see right now. I think abstract art does a really good job of that. And then as Christians, being able to say, I can take from this artwork I can be reminded of maybe this gets back to the story. I can be reminded of my place in this gospel story. I can be reminded of my place in this redemption narrative. And I can, there's times that art calls us, I think, to praise. There's time that art invites us into curiosity about our neighbor. There's time that art might even call us to confession by showing us parts about ourselves that we would prefer remain hidden. But I think all of that is possible because art gets across indefinable but inescapable meaning, you know?
Yeah, I love it. Last week when Mitch Thomas was on, he said, sometimes we think of art as Christians, we want it to be sweet almost, but or redemptive if we're reading a story where in the end is the redemption. But what I heard you just say is even if the piece itself standing alone is dark with no redemptive element, we can say this is part of the arc of humanity. There is a dark point. And so we don't have to be afraid, or we don't have to reject this piece just because it in itself doesn't have a redemptive element. We can experience it as part of the larger arc of humanity's story and identify that, because we are living that arc over and over again in our own lives of creation, fall, reconciliation, and redemption. We can experience that over and over. And so to say, okay, this may not feel sweet to me, and that's okay. As a believer, this is part of humanity's story. And the closer I am to it, almost, the closer I am to the hope as well.
Yes, exactly. And I think that can be, I think we need to be thoughtful about the kind of visual diets that we have. Maybe we don't want to have all of our art be sad and hard all the time. But something that I often tell my students is the more that we understand really and fully the brokenness of this world, the bigger that Jesus has to be to make the sad things untrue. And so we shouldn't be afraid of looking at art that shows us some of these cracks in our history, that shows us ways that we have failed, that shows us even ways that the church has failed. And if we engage with those well, we can wrestle, really and honestly with the darkness of sin, and then say, come quickly, Lord Jesus, I need you now more than ever. So these don't have to be things that, leave us down in the dumps. We can turn them into these opportunities for anticipation and praise for the God who says that he will make all things new.
Yeah, I love that. That's really a beautiful way to say it. I also think it helps name an emotion or a period of time in a culture's being. Alex and I were a part of a group where Gayla Irwin took us through this exercise where she brought all of these postcards, and each one had a different, they were all by the same artist, but they were different images. And she had us pick one that described something about our current life. And it was absolutely incredible and powerful. The artist is named, Alex, do you remember? It's Carolyn Aust, I think is her name. I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, that sounds right.
I think
she's from San Francisco, I think.
Berkeley, right? She's from Berkeley. Anyway, so she's a beautiful artist and has all of these images that can really be translated and reflect different parts of the spiritual life. But what I found that it did is, we can identify, for example, with something someone writes and it really resonates and we read it, but there was something different about choosing a card that visually depicted where we were at. And like mine, for example, it was like 5 people in a boat, and the boat was above rocks and in the air and kind of floating over the sea. And and there was something, like, I still can name it, and I have it in my journal, and I wrote about it. And it's just so interesting because it helped name something that I didn't even know needed to be named. Like I didn't know when I picked it, when we went to that exercise, that I needed to name that current season. But to this day, I remember exactly that postcard because it did help me name it. So can you speak a little bit to how art can kind of reach the depths of those places that sometimes we don't even know or fully understand that we need to be mined?
Yeah, I love that. And that reminds me of some advice that I often give to people when they're going to an art museum, particularly to a really big art museum, is don't worry about trying to find all of the famous things that are in the museum. And definitely don't worry about trying to read all of the labels next to things because you'll never make it through. Just just walk through and find the things that hit you, and it might be that an artwork jumps out at you because it is an echo, because it has a resonance with where you are emotionally, spiritually right now. It might be because it reminds you of where you're not and you long to be in this other kind of world. It might remind you of a loved one or something like that. But I think all of those personal connections to artworks are the the perfect kind of opening, right? To interact with something that might feel a little bit unruly, that might feel a little bit strange. It's hard to explain it to someone else. But I've had that experience myself of artworks that almost are like a form of liturgy for me. That when I am feeling a particular way, I know that I can return to some of these artworks and they will help me breathe a little bit better. They make me feel a little bit less alone. They remind me of promises or prayers. And they form a kind of scaffolding for me in a way that feels so grounding to go back to them and to say, okay, show me again how I need to do this right now.
And that makes art very accessible because
Mhm.
you don't have to be an art historian and know all of those things and understand all of those things that are written next to the piece in the museum to be able to understand or know, I like that, or I feel something when I look at that. And I'm trying to
Mhm.
figure out what that is. And so for our listeners to know that that is an okay way to approach visual art, is to check in with yourself and see how you're interacting with it, and that's good enough. You don't necessarily need to know all of the extras, though the
Mhm.
extras may help explain some things about where the artist was or what the artist's message is.
Yes, exactly. And I think also checking in with yourself when you really don't like something, can also be a real growing experience to say, oh, why am I not responding well to this thing? And maybe you're not always going to be in a place where you have the wherewithal to do that in the museum. But I think letting artworks kind of just get inside of you and live inside of you for a bit, thinking about interacting with art, particularly in a museum context, as being these doors, these launching points for opening into greater curiosity about a time period, about a culture, about a world that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. I think that's really, just one of the most exciting things about going to a museum is all of these worlds that you have access to.
I think it's an interesting point. You're talking about going and seeing art in person. And I'll never forget the
Mhm.
first time I was studying abroad and I was taking an art history class. And we would study the paintings in class, and then I'd get to actually go see them in
Yeah.
these museums. And I'd travel on weekends. And I remember the first time I saw a Peter Paul Rubens piece and in person, and I just looked at it for the longest time. I mean, I just was captivated.
Mhm.
And there is a difference between seeing something on the computer and standing in front of a piece of art. So, why is it that we really should and maybe should is the wrong word, but why would you encourage people to actually go and see art that is in museums and that maybe your local city, your nearest city offers? Why is that different than engaging it online? Because we can engage art online, and that's a form, but it is different.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you asked that, because I do think it's really important to go and to see art in person, um, because we are embodied souls, like we don't just take in information in this purely intellectual way through our eyes. We're not just optical creatures. And so when we are with an actual art object in person, there is a whole embodied experience, a phenomenological experience that goes along with that, where you see it differently when you are up close versus when you're far away. You maybe understand it differently in conversation with other artworks that have been placed next to it. For a sculpture, you can walk all the way around it. For a photograph, being able to, get really close and seeing all the little details in it. These are all things that we can only do when we're there in person. And I think it also really helps us to remember that artworks are made things, that they are objects, not just images, right? That they are a thing made by another image bearer. So another thing that I encourage folks to do when they go to museums is, before you worry about the subject matter in an artwork, before you get caught up in, oh, I don't know what this symbolism is or something like that, is to just really take some time to appreciate what you're looking at as something that was made by another created being. Someone like you with a body made this thing. And that's just incredible to think about, manipulating paint or clay, to understand the light in a way to photograph all of these things, and just saying, oh, that's part of our image bearing, is doing stuff with the material world. And I think that certainly I'm so grateful for technology that allows us to see artworks at a distance, see things that we might never have access to otherwise. But there's nothing that can beat going and seeing something in person.
Yeah, my dad was an artist by profession, and he did many environments. He worked in textiles, so he would do entire rooms or chapels that people would experience. And so you could see pictures of that, but that was going to be a very different experience than actually being there. And
Yes.
that particular form of artwork was meant to be experienced in person in a different way almost. So I can appreciate how different it is when you see something in person and when you see other images of it. I want to go back to you talking about things that you don't like and how you have that kind of, I'm not really sure I like that, because I follow you on Instagram, and I would encourage other people to follow you because you have great tips on how to see and how to look, and maybe see things with new eyes. So if people are wanting to learn how to look in a different way, I think your Instagram account gives some good insights in that. But what caught my attention the first time I visited your account was your description of yourself, the words that you used. And it's something around, I help you see how art you don't like can help you love your neighbor, or something like that. So tell us how that is true. How can, when we interact with something we don't like, how can it help us understand God's humanity better and maybe connect with people better?
Yeah. So this is built off of something my husband likes to say about me when he's trying to explain what it is I do to people. And he'll say, if you go to a museum and the contemporary section, all the stuff that you don't like, that's what Elissa studies. So my area of focus is modern and contemporary art, which tends to elicit strong emotions from people. And then even more particularly, I look at a lot of work that has to deal with the human body and identity. So sometimes that means that I'm looking at artworks that um, just have a lot to do, maybe use human hair as part of it, or maybe confronting some of the ugly legacies of racism, are exploring some of the um, our very narrow ideas of what constitutes a beautiful body versus an ugly body, things like that. And and I don't look at these because I get a warm and fuzzy feeling at the end of the day, you know. Um, I I look at them because they make me uncomfortable, because they make me wriggle in my skin a little bit, trying to figure out, why don't I want to see that? Or why does this use of hair, when it's not attached to a body, why do I find that unsettling in this way? And learning how to engage with rupture as an invitation for entering into a conversation rather than a reason to leave the conversation has been incredibly important for me. So when I feel that sense of uneasiness, I could say, oh, that's a sign to head out, go look at something pretty instead. But if we see that uneasiness as instead a portal, as an opening for stepping into something that is different, stepping into something that is uncomfortable, that's where the real conversation and work and learning can start. Because education always has to have an element of discomfort to it, you know? And so part of this was me literally learning about more about African American history by studying artists, learning more about the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 90s by studying artists, learning more about the experiences of the Caribbean diaspora by studying artists from these communities, violence in Colombia, any sort of number of these things, and artists being so generous to make work about stories that I didn't care about, that I didn't know about, and letting them live these lives in museums where someone like me could interact with them and then say, oh, maybe part of why I'm uncomfortable is because this is so unfamiliar. What happens if I love my neighbor by learning more about that story? So that's something that doesn't happen just in the art gallery, right? It's something you have to take home with you. It's something that you have to be willing to put some work into. But I have found so much richness by being willing to, by being caught up in a conversation with an artwork and then realizing, oh, I need to go learn more about this now because my body has been implicated in it in some way. You know, I've had this kind of embodied experience with it, and now I need to go learn more.
It's really about looking for God's truth as expressed by other people.
Yeah.
So if somebody's had another experience that's different than from what we understand, or has encountered the world in a different way than we have, and then expresses it visually through art, and then we have this dynamic experience with the piece of art, it allows us to experience God's creation through the work of another image bearer, just like you said earlier. I find it very fascinating that God, who we know from the very beginning was a creator, is a creator, and made us in his image as creators, that we get to share life together through experiencing artists' work.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. And certainly there are other artists, contemporary artists, who are very focused specifically on community building, right? So whether it is a muralist who wants to draw from the community around them to participate in mural making, or artists like Theaster Gates who sort of put themselves down in a particular neighborhood and have these sites, these locations that are inviting communal creativity. But even beyond that, I think that you're exactly right that these artworks, by telling stories that show some of the variety, some of the rich texture of these stories that God has given to his image bearers, that we can build better relationships.
Well, while we're wrapping up this interview today, I just am wondering, are there some resources that people can grab onto this summer if they're just thinking, you know what, I've got a few weeks that before school hits and I'd like to try my hand at some art, or dive into, looking at different artists, or kind of like what you just said, dive into this subject through art. I want to learn more about this period in history or this part of the world, and I'm going to start, looking up artists in that. So can you recommend some places where people can begin?
Yeah. I would say that the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, I think it's metmuseum.org, their website is just a treasure trove of information. They have artifacts from all over the world, from different time periods, and a really excellent timeline of world art history. So if there's a period that you're interested in, the Metropolitan's website, their Heilbrunn timeline is a great starting point for that. I think if folks are interested in learning more specifically about visual art and faith, there's a great edited volume by Ned Bustard called It Was Good, Making Art to the Glory of God. And there's all these short essays in there of artists and pastors answering questions like, do we need art, and what is beauty, and things like that. So that's also like a really great resource. And I think in terms of making, I would encourage folks to pay attention to places of creativity that they already have, and to invest purposefully in those. So maybe if you are already interested in cooking, then see that as a creative endeavor and think about how you can nourish that. If you are already interested in, having a fun wardrobe, then think about how you can be very purposeful and ethical in that. If you already dabble in watercolor, there's a whole host of, YouTube tutorials that can help you grow in that. But I think recognizing the places where we are already honoring our creativity as image bearers, and then investing into that is going to be a lot more productive than trying to pick up something, sort of brand new.
That is a really great perspective. And I like the idea of kind of one of the things, we did an interview a long time ago with Ken Whitesmut, and he would say, push the reset button, or refresh. I mean, his big thing is refresh, just like you would with a computer, like refresh. And, but what I like about it is that's basically what you're saying, like refresh what you're already doing and see if you can infuse some new life into it and some new creativity that's going to just take it to the next level for you and really make it, kind of enliven that passion a little bit that's already there.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, thank you, Elissa. This has been wonderful. And we're so excited to share you with our listeners, and people can learn more about you by going to Instagram, but where else can they find you?
So I'm on Instagram at Elissa Brodt, and I also have a website, elissa.weichbrodt.org, that has links to some of my writing and to some lectures that I've given.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, have a great day.
Thank you. It's so nice to talk to you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.